everybody. Welcome back to the Highland Bridge Community Church of Lowell, Ohio's weekly remote worship service. I'm Pastor Kevin, and we're glad you could be with us today. If not in person, then at least online. This past week, we witnessed the inauguration of Joe Biden as the 46th President of the United States and Kamala Harris as Vice President. And as we lift up our prayers, praises, and concerns, we want to remember President Biden and Vice President Harris, as well as outgoing President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. Throughout the tenure of the new President and Vice President, I pray for them to have godly wisdom, as God gave to King Solomon, for hearts that seek after God, as Solomon's father King David had, and that they would fulfill their duties faithfully as King Saul did in the early days of his reign. I pray that they will not abuse their power, as Saul did in his last days, or as David did and later repented of. But I pray that they'll truly seek after the peace and unity that they call for throughout both the transition and the duration of their term or terms, that their conduct and their policies would always be focused on God's will, and that they would be successful in protecting and defending the United States, its people, and its Constitution. For President Trump, I pray for peace and God's comfort as he faces ongoing attacks of his political enemies, even after the end of his presidency. And I pray that God's will be done in his life, politically, professionally, and personally. And that these events will draw him closer to God and build his faith. We know that he's fairly young in his faith journey, and I pray for continued growth as he transitions into this next chapter in his life. Now, as we know, of course, this was a highly contested election, even to the point that a protest outside the Capitol turned into a riot. Now, I, of course, condemned the riot, saying that protests need to be peaceful and that we should not resort to violence. And I stand by that position today. I want to make that perfectly clear. However, I have heard a lot of people saying that violence is never the answer, particularly political violence. And while I agree with the sentiment that we should avoid violence, is it really true that violence, even political violence, is never the answer? Well, today I want to give you the answer from two perspectives, biblically and historically. And I want you to listen to the whole message because the overall context matters. And if you only listen to part of the message, then it may be easy to misunderstand what I'm trying to say. So today we're going to be focusing on Matthew chapters 10 and 26. I'd like to begin with chapter 10 and verse 16. In Matthew 10, Jesus sent out his 12 disciples into a hostile world. He warned them, saying, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account, you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Now, he was not only prophesying to them, but also to us, his followers, thousands of years later. As much as we think the world is against us now, and it is, we haven't seen anything yet. But be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves, he says in verse 16. And I think we can safely infer from that he expects us to defend ourselves, but without compromising our integrity. It's better to fight with our minds rather than with our hands. And here's the important thing, without resorting to the worldly tactics of the enemy. If we allow them to drag us down to their level, then we lose, and Satan wins. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another, he says in verse 23. So we are to walk away from trouble when you can, as it says in the Kenny Rogers song, Coward of the County. Or even run if you have to. But is it really as simple as that? In Luke 22 at the Last Supper, Jesus was preparing his disciples to survive after he was gone. In verse 36, he told his disciples, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Then in verse 38, the disciples said, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. "That's enough," he replied. So he was clearly teaching them to have weapons on hand for protection. But a short time later, when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, Simon Peter defended him by using his sword to cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus stopped him, saying, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." That's Matthew 26:52. Now this seems contradictory, that Jesus would first tell them to buy weapons for protection, and then, mere hours later, rebuke them for using them. But I think the next verse clears it up. Matthew 26:53, Jesus continues, "Do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then could the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. And the chapter goes on to describe how Jesus faced and submitted to the injustices of a rigged system that convicted him with false evidence and false witnesses. But you see, Jesus wasn't saying that there's never a time to take up the sword, but this specifically was not the time. He didn't need anybody to defend him because he was God's son. He literally had all the armies of heaven at his beck and call. But he didn't call on them because this was God's plan. His death wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Not a loss, but the next step toward the ultimate victory. Jesus wasn't leading a political rebellion, but a spiritual one. The political and church leaders of the day saw him as a political revolutionary. And as I pointed out in last year's Easter message, that's how I believe Judas saw him too. But they were wrong. His battle was not against flesh and blood, but against the literal forces of darkness. He didn't need a sword. He was the sword. And this, by the way, is an important lesson for we who call ourselves Christians. God doesn't need us to protect him, particularly with violence. We don't force people to convert to Christianity at the end of a sword, or at the barrel of a gun, or by our fists. We appeal to them with the power of persuasion. We convince them with the uncompromising truth, with salt and light. And when they open their minds, they find the truth undeniable. That is the way Jesus taught us to build his kingdom, not with violence, but with truth and love. But we do still live in a dangerous world, a world that is becoming increasingly hostile towards Christians and people of faith. And going back to Matthew 10 again, Jesus says in verse 34, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." So clearly Jesus isn't saying that there's never a time to take up the sword. In fact, I would say to never say never, but then I would be saying never. But you should rarely say never. There's almost always an exception to the rule, as we've seen even throughout the Bible. Now, that's not to throw out the rules, but to obey them in the spirit in which they were intended. And I'll go into more detail on that at some other time. One example I can think of right off the top of my head is Jesus healing on the Sabbath. But as it says in Ecclesiastes, there's a time and a place for all things under the sun, including a time for war and a time for peace, a time to kill and a time to heal. The Old Testament particularly is filled with violence, sometimes endorsed and even commanded by God. So we can't pretend like it didn't happen. And someday Jesus is returning with that sword that he promised, as it describes it in Revelation chapter 19. "I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So we can't say that violence is never the answer, not when God not only endorses it, but commands it at times, and even commits it at times. Jesus did encourage submission to the ruling government. One example was when the tax collectors came to collect. And even though he could have argued that he was exempt, he sent his disciples to catch a fish, and the coins that they needed were in its mouth. This, by the way, is an example of him being shrewd as a snake and innocent as a dove, rising above his enemies rather than stooping to their level. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 13:1, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." He goes on to explain that rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. And they are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. But what happens when it's the government doing wrong? When they're not bringing punishment on the wrongdoer, but they are the wrongdoer? Should we then submit to them as a matter of conscience? What about the Nazis during World War II? Should the Germans have just submitted to Hitler as a matter of conscience? The German people? Well, obviously, the assumption Paul makes here is that the government is a godly one. Of course, we're supposed to submit to godly governments. But what about ungodly ones? Well, there were times that we saw Jesus put the political and religious leaders in their place, but we did also see Jesus submit to the ungodly Roman government, even unto his own death. The apostles defended themselves in court from their persecutors, but they did not fight back with violence when they were abused. Throughout the Old Testament, we saw the patriarchs and the prophets also stand up to ungodly leaders and governments, and even their own kings, without resorting to violence. They just said their piece, then stood back and let God do the physical stuff. But then again, there were times that they took up their swords and fought the physical fight as well. So what it comes down to is that there's a time and a place for war and peace. I'm reminded of the sheriff's wife in the classic, I think it was 1956, Western High Noon. She abhorred violence. She saw so much death in her childhood that as an adult she became a Quaker and a pacifist. She begged her husband, the sheriff, to leave town, to run away from the threat that was coming for him. But he stood his ground. When the outlaws had him cornered and were about to shoot him dead, she picked up a gun and did what she had to do. Now, sometime I'll have to go back and go into more detail about Kings David and Saul, but I don't have the time today. And when I do, I'll get into more detail about our form of government compared with the biblical form of government. But if you want to see some really contentious transfers of power, go back sometime and read the book of 1 Samuel. But here in the United States, we're living in a democratic republic. So from a historical American perspective, what did America's founding fathers think of political violence? Let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence. Now here's the text from the National Archives. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And that's what they did. They protested to the king. They peacefully made their complaints known. And when they were not resolved, they declared their independence. It's like a father telling his son, "You live under my roof, you'll follow my rules." So the son says, "Fine, I'll live under my own roof." And he moves out. Or an employee decides he doesn't like his job, so he quits. We certainly can't fault someone for doing that. It's their right. But what happens when your father says he won't let you move out? Or your boss won't let you quit? They hold you by force, making you stay. Then you're no longer a son or an employee. You're a slave. So when America's founders were pursued by the king's men and forcibly compelled to remain slaves of a tyrannical government, they took up arms and, with violence, fought for their freedom. They didn't go looking for a fight. They didn't start the war, but they didn't back down from it either. As the Declaration of Independence continues where we left off, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. In other words, it's wise to put up with minor abuses as long as you can. Political revolt is not something that anyone should welcome lightly. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And it goes on to describe their grievances, the peaceful attempts they made at resolution, and the ultimate failure of diplomacy. Therefore, they found it necessary to hold the government of the king to be, quote, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So they didn't go looking for war. They went out of their way to avoid it. But eventually the time came when they decided that it was not only their right, but their duty to throw off the government. And when attacked, defended themselves. So they fought the Revolutionary War, and America won her independence. We were given one of the greatest nations to ever grace the face of the earth. And I pray that we may preserve it, even in this time of great upheaval. So yes, to answer my earlier question, we walk away from trouble when we can. But there comes a time when you have to stand and fight. The teachings of Jesus and the Founding Fathers seem to agree that violence should be a last resort. Even Jesus, with his second coming, brings violence only as a last resort. As it says in 1 Peter 3:9, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise to return, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. He doesn't want anyone to have to go to hell. It was never intended for us. But it is there because we choose for it to be. We fall by his sword because we choose it. In the end, we reap what we sow. As a Christian and as a believer in the ultimate power of God's will, I believe that the same principle applies to our government and to our leaders as well. In the end, justice will prevail. So as the Apostle Paul concludes in Romans 13:7, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, I want to be clear, I'm presenting this message in the context of current events, so it may be easy to make some assumptions in the parallels. So I want to emphasize that I am not defending what happened at the Capitol earlier this month. I am not conflating it with our nation or with our founding fathers' actions some 250 years ago. Our founders did try to overthrow the king and the established government, even though the king was a tyrant. They simply said, "We're not part of it anymore. We're leaving. We're no longer going to live under your roof or by your rules." But the tragic thing today is that a significant segment of the American people no longer trust our system. They believe in the principles that govern us, but they don't trust those who are supposed to be guarding, protecting, and preserving them. For the most part, they believe in the democratic process, but they believe that it's been usurped. They believe in the game, but they believe that the referees are cheating. And unfortunately, the game is only as good as its referee. If we're ever going to regain that trust, to rebuild the bridge between the people and the government, to restore trust in the democratic process, then there need to be honest and open, full investigations into the allegations of election fraud. Fight the skepticism with facts and evidence, not with censorship. Fight misinformation with more information, not less. When you silence dissenting voices, you don't restore faith and trust, you reinforce suspicion. Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 10:26, "Do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs." Don't be afraid of liars and their lies, and don't give them power by suppressing them. Instead, counter their lies with the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, thank you for joining us for this week's message. If you'd like to join us in person, once we reopen, we're at the Highland Ridge Community Church, 2200 Highland Ridge Road, Lowell, Ohio, 45744. In the meantime, you can find us online on YouTube, Library, that's LBRY, Rumble, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, spelled Parler, MeWe, that's MEWE, and Instagram. Just search for Pastor Kevin HRCC, all one word, and you should find us. Assuming, of course, that the platforms are still available. We haven't been booted off. But if you can't find us on one, try another. Or you can email me directly at pastorkevinhrcc@minister.com. I hope you have a great week and that you'll be back next time. So make sure you join, follow, or subscribe, whichever the case may be, so that you'll have access to our videos. In the meantime, this is Pastor Kevin from the Highland Ridge Community Church saying, take care and God bless.